Warning: the content of these videos contains adult themes which may be distressing. Viewer discretion is advised. Hello everyone, and welcome back to True Crime with Mystery Maverick. One of the main tenets of the state's case against Darlie was that while the boy's injuries were deep and penetrating, Darlie's were superficial surface wounds that she herself had inflicted. Thus, several themes would emerge throughout the trial regarding the severity and nature of Darlie's injuries. Firstly, that Darlie's wounds were superficial and not serious, which did not correspond to the boy's deep wounds. Secondly, that Darlie's injuries were self-inflicted and not defensive in nature. Thirdly, that Darlie's wounds were suicidal rather than homicidal in intent. And lastly, the contradictory ideas that Darlie was able to inflict the injuries on both herself and the boys as she was in the throes of a deep depression and money pressures had caused her to snap, and that on the other hand she was a cold and calculated woman, so much so that she had planned and premeditated the murders due to her psychopathic personality traits. I will address these points by presenting the state's evidence and witness testimony related to them. I will further analyse them in line with the current forensic knowledge, research and literature, and discuss the relevance of each point as it relates to Darlie's case. As we go through the series, I ask that you reflect on each piece of evidence and consider the likelihood or probability of the conclusions made in this case. Because while anything is possible, not everything is probable. As we continue to unravel the mystery, dying for justice, the wrongful conviction of Darlie Routier. As the trial commenced, most of Darlie's family members had been sequestered as possible witnesses, which meant they were not allowed inside the courtroom during the testimony. Nevertheless, many of them waited outside in support of Darlie's innocence. Darren's brother Dion reaffirmed the whole family's faith in Darlie to reporters from the Dallas Morning News. "If I thought for one instance that she did it, I would not be backing her," he said. The same article from the Dallas Morning News on the 7th of January 1997 said that Darren was notably absent, which Dion further commented on. "He was really quiet this morning. He is going through a hard time. I think the reality of it has really hit him today." Other family members further added that Darren did not see the point in attending if he would not be allowed into the courtroom, and that the prospect of waiting outside would have been, quote, too nerve-wracking. One family member who was not sequestered had managed to get a seat in the gallery. Much to the prosecution's annoyance, Darren's Aunt Sandy had not only slipped under their radar, but was taking detailed notes throughout the trial. Meanwhile, inside the courtroom, prosecutors attempted to show Darlie's wounds were not severe, and they called several witnesses to the stand. Despite both their reports and testimony indicating that Darlie's injuries were indeed of a serious nature, the word superficial would become synonymous with Darlie's case. Darlie had several injuries. Of most concern to the surgeons was the single 9 cm incise wound from the right to the left midline of Darlie's neck. She also had a stab wound to her left upper chest shoulder area that, although shallow, went through the skin, fat and into the muscle. Her third injury was a stab wound to her right forearm, and that had reached but had not nicked the bone underneath, along with a smaller incise wound above it. At one point in the proceedings, the court asked Darlie to remove the scarf around her neck to reveal her injuries, which Townsend Parchman would point to for the purpose of the jury. She testified that Darlie's wounds were relatively superficial because the wounds were not deep and had not hit any vital structures. The state had Dr. Santos, who had attempted to save Damon, reiterate that his wounds were deep and penetrating, such that he was pronounced dead on arrival. He testified that after pronouncing Damon's death, he immediately went to help with the adult patient. Dr. Santos mentions in his testimony that Dr. Lee had been the primary surgeon and that he was assisted by Dr. Dillon. Dr. Lee was never called to testify. This would become a running theme throughout the trial, where key players involved in the case were not called to testify. Santos went on to say that Darlie's neck wound was superficial in that it did not go past the platysma, so it is still, in medical terms, superficial. He further added that due to the proximity of the wound to the vital structures, that all wounds to the neck would be considered superficial until the point that they are fatal. Under cross-examination, he acknowledged that had Darlie's neck wound reached the carotid sheath within just 2 to 3 millimeters more, it would have reached the carotid artery and the jugular vein. He said had the wound reached either, Darlie would have profusely bled to death within a matter of minutes. He further recalled telling Darlie she was extremely lucky, a phrase you would usually say to someone who had narrowly escaped death. He testified that he had applied pressure to Darlie's neck wound, which seems a rather extreme practice for a non-serious injury. Furthermore, his own medical report stated that Darlie's neck wound was bleeding profusely from the muscle at the time of surgery. He stated that Darlie was rushed to the operating room and underwent exploratory surgery under anaesthesia for around an hour and 15 minutes, the majority of which was spent on Darlie's neck wound. He said that they had stitched her neck wound up internally and sutured it closed, which further indicates that the wound to Darlie's neck was indeed serious. On an episode of The Last Defense, forensic pathologist Dr. Gregory Davis said, "In medicine, superficial is a relative term. I would collegiately but vehemently disagree that Darlie Routier had a superficial wound to the neck." He points to the fact that the surgeon noted that several small blood vessels originating from the internal jugular vein were ligated, meaning that the surgeon had to go inside the wound and tie off the blood vessels so that Darlie had not bled to death. That is a serious injury, he said. This was further confirmed by Dr. Dillon, who had performed Darlie's surgery, who reiterated that superficial in this instance was just a medical term used to indicate that an injury did not hit any vital structures. He further explained that although the stab wound to Darlie's right forearm went all the way to the bone, that it is still categorized as superficial in medical terms due to the proximity of the bone to the surface of the arm. He also noted that upon exploration of the neck wound, he could see Darlie's carotid sheath, and that cutting of the carotid artery was more serious than cutting the jugular vein. He too confirmed that had the wound reached the carotid artery, that Darlie would have bled to death within minutes. Some weeks into the trial, on the 28th of January 1997, the defense would call to the stand world-renowned forensic pathologist and author of several texts and scientific journals, Dr. Vincent DeMaio, to the stand. Originally hired by Darlie's state-appointed attorney Douglas Parks, he was one of the only experts retained by trial attorney Douglas Mulder, a fact that in hindsight would prove detrimental to his ability to adequately defend his client. DeMaio testified that he had reviewed several documents related to Darlie's injuries, including Darlie's admittance, surgery reports, and photos of her injuries. Referring to the surgery reports written by Dr. Santos, he explained that Darlie had lost a significant amount of blood. He stated that upon arrival to the hospital around 3:30 a.m. that Darlie's hemoglobin levels were around 11.6, and by the next morning it had dropped a further 2 points to 9.6. He explained that significance of the loss is not reflected in the initial readings due to the body's natural ability to compensate the loss by mobilizing other fluids from outside of the bloodstream. He further pointed to the fact that the diagnosis from the operating surgeon was acute post-hemorrhagic anemia, a diagnosis given to people who suffer extreme blood loss. He further confirmed that had Darlie's neck wound gone just a millimetre or two more, it would have hit the carotid artery, and without immediate medical attention that she would have, without a doubt, bled to death. Despite the physical and medical evidence suggesting that Darlie was seriously injured and even close to death, these facts are ignored, and people continue to circulate the idea that Darlie had a small scratch to the throat to this day. On a post-trial episode of Death Row Stories, prosecutor Toby Shook said on the subject, "They didn't go deep, and it was just a straight slash across this way, and that's why we call them superficial wounds. But if there really was a killer in there doing those things to those boys, he would have stabbed Darlie Routier multiple times right through the chest like he did those boys, and she'd be dead." The prosecution's assertions that Darlie's wounds were not the same as the boys, and therefore Darlie must be guilty, neglects to consider the complex dynamics of a knife attack, the positioning of those involved, the strength and ability of Darlie to fight off an attacker as opposed to the boys, nor does it recognise the symbolic nature of a homicidal neck wound as the kill shot. It is simply a myth that during an attack in a dynamic situation, the injuries would match on all victims. One example of this would be the heartbreaking murder of Logan Tipton, a 6-year-old murdered in his bed by a stranger in his own home in Versailles, Kentucky. Ronald Exantus, having driven over 150 miles, chose the Tipton home at random. Taking a large butcher knife he had found in the Tipton kitchen, he headed upstairs into the bedroom where the Tipton siblings slept, launching a ferocious attack and stabbing Logan repeatedly in the head. Logan's eldest sister is said to have tried to protect her other siblings by launching herself at him and screaming to wake her dad in a nearby room. In the process, she was slashed with the knife, and so was her younger sister. Their father had awoken and had managed to restrain Exantus while receiving some slash wounds too. So why did Logan receive deep, penetrating stab wounds to the head, but his sisters and father had not received any fatal injuries? Does this mean that the father or sisters were guilty of his murder? Of course not. Logan was asleep in his bed and was completely vulnerable and could not fight back. On the other hand, the attack on Logan had awakened the other siblings. They had awoken and tried to defend him themselves, and so received defensive wounds, but were luckily able to avoid any deep, penetrating or life-threatening injuries. The prosecution's final witness, FBI agent Alan Brantley, would testify that based on the boy's injuries in comparison to what he knew of Darlie's, that it indicated that the boys were targeted by someone they knew. He further suggested that an intruder would take out the greater threat first and not the children. This fails to consider the fact that Darlie was no threat to anyone. Would an armed intruder really see a young sleeping female as a threat? If they did, maybe there would be far less assaults and attacks on women in general. This was sadly not the case for 4-year-old Dakota Lane, who was stabbed 36 times with a pair of scissors by a stranger as he slept in his Muskogee, Oklahoma home. Stephanie Lane, Dakota's pregnant mother, had also received injuries whilst trying to protect her son from the unknown intruder. Although she and her unborn baby did not receive any life-threatening injuries, Dakota would tragically succumb to his extensive injuries. An 18-year-old boy, Aaron Lacancella, who had been staying with his cousin on the same street as the Lanes, later admitted to a number of charges related to the home invasion murder and was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. When asked why he had killed the boy, he said, "I do not know." The truth is that people are subjected to and survive horrific attacks all the time, and sometimes they don't. This is likely to be because of situational variances and how an attack plays out in different scenarios, and sometimes just by the grace of God, and therefore no conclusions can be made from differing injuries or fatalities in any given situation. The fact that Darlie didn't die from her injuries does not mean she killed her children, nor does the fact that her injuries were slightly different to the boys. If Darlie had passed out following the cutting of her throat, it is likely that the intruder had believed he had killed Darlie too. L.J. Bobbish was just 12 years old when a friend of his sister, Mark Edwards, who had robbed his father, L.J. Sr., just a few days prior, attempted to wipe out the entire family. Edwards shot Joanna, his mother, his father Larry, and his pregnant sister Crystal to death, before turning the gun on LJ and shooting him in the head. Unsatisfied with that, he came back a second time with a knife from the kitchen and cut LJ's throat 3 times. If that wasn't enough, he then set fire to the home to make sure they were all dead. Having passed out, 12-year-old LJ had awoken in the burning home with his head dangling, covered in blood and smoke, with a gunshot wound to the head, managed to make his way to the front yard of his home, where he was seen and eventually airlifted to hospital, where he would make a miraculous recovery. On December 31st, 1999, one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, Tommy Lynn Sells, had thought the same as he left the Harris home in Del Rio, Texas. Sells had been an acquaintance of the father of the household, Terry Harris. Terry said that he had met Sells at church and he had even come to the home on one occasion, but thought it odd that Sells would repeatedly say how lucky he was. Just hours before, at a gas station, Terry had encountered Sells, and spotting luggage piled up in Terry's truck, Sells had asked where he was going. Unwittingly, Terry had just let the most savage and brutal killer know he was going to be out of town and that his family were home alone. Only it wasn't just the Harris family staying in the home. That night, 10-year-old Crystal Searles and her younger sister Marquise, 7, had been staying with the Harris family in their mobile home. After some bickering between the young siblings, Marquise, the youngest, would give in with much disappointment and retire to the spare room, while Crystal would stay on the top bunk of the Harris's 13-year-old daughter, Kayleen Harris. Down the hall in the master bedroom slept Terry's wife, Crystal Harris, with her youngest child. Around 4 o'clock in the morning, Sells would gain entry through a window at the side of the home with a large boning knife in hand. As he slipped into the bedroom of the Harris's eldest son, 14-year-old Justin. The young boy, blind from birth, had awoken to a noise, but thinking it was the young girls in the home messing around, he called out, "I wish you all would quit coming in my room." Tommy left the room and walked around the home looking in each bedroom. In his confession to the Texas Rangers, Sells said that he had seen Marquise in one room before going to the room of the Harris's matriarch, Crystal, where he remembers touching her leg, before entering the room where young Crystal Searles and Kayleen Harris slept. He got into the bottom bunk with Kayleen, where he cut off her underwear, sexually assaulted her, and slit her throat a few times as a terrified Crystal peered through the slats of the top bunk. He was about to leave when he remembered the girl on the top bunk. He walked towards Crystal and told her to move her hands that she had thrown up to protect herself as her friend lay dying on the floor. He then leant over the top bunk and slit Crystal's throat before leaving. Crystal pretended to be dead for a few minutes until she knew he had left, and she had tried to comfort Kayleen for a few moments and heard her take her last agonizing breath. Thinking everyone in the home was dead or injured, Crystal miraculously managed to make her way to the nearest neighbour's house, where she was airlifted to hospital. Crystal later said to 48 Hours news reporter Harold Dow, "He meant to kill me when he slit my throat. He thought I was dead. I pretended I was dead." When speaking of her survival, Crystal said, "People say I'm so brave and courageous, but really I'm just lucky." In an interview for 48 Hours, Sells later confirmed this when he admitted that he had been caught because he had left someone alive. "My daddy told me a long time ago, dead men tells no tales," he said. The state further contended that Darlie's injuries were self-inflicted and not defensive in nature. To demonstrate this, they called Janice Townsend Parchment to testify regarding her evaluation of Darlie's injuries at the hospital post-surgery. She stated that the wounds to Darlie's neck and chest were completely covered in steri strips, and that one of the wounds to her arms was completely sutured closed. The only wound that was uncovered was a small wound to Darlie's right forearm. Greg Davis asked if she had an opinion as to whether Darlie's wounds were self-inflicted, to which Mulder objected to this line of questioning. He questioned the witness's qualifications to give such an opinion. However, the judge overruled, another theme that would come up throughout the trial. The defense would object and the judge would overrule. However, when it came to the prosecution's objections, the judge would ask the defense to rephrase or move on. Mulder would insist that Darlie's wounds were covered and that it was impossible to determine Darlie's wounds were self-inflicted from such a peripheral analysis. The judge overruled again and the witness would continue. She said that it was possible that Darlie's wounds were self-inflicted, but that it was also possible that someone else had inflicted them. So in conclusion, the doctor's opinion as to whether Darlie had self-inflicted her injuries was tantamount to, "I do not really know." The prosecution went on to ask about Darlie's nightshirt and if the defects in the shirt matched up with her injuries. She stated that Darlie's injuries did not match up with the defects in the shirt. She did not elaborate on her analysis and how she had determined if the defects had matched or not. This would also become a running theme throughout the trial, where expert witnesses would state something as fact without detailing the processes of how they had arrived at their conclusions. Later at trial, these conclusions were challenged by Dr. Vincent DeMayo for the defense. He said that he had seen over a few hundred victims of stabbing along with their clothing and personal effects. He stated that it was not unusual to see defects in clothing that did not correspond to the injury sites. He explained that this was because it is not someone stabbing straight through. There is usually a struggle and clothing is pulled away from the body. Moreover, the literature shows that self-inflicted injuries are largely absent of clothing altogether. To my knowledge, Damon's t-shirt was never analysed regarding the defects. However, we see from the photo exhibits that the defects in his shirt do not match up to his underlying injuries, which is evidenced by the fact that Damon's shirt had 9 defects, yet he only had 4 penetrating stab wounds and 2 incised wounds to the back of his body. This further supports DeMayo's assertions that clothing is pulled away or moves around on the body in a dynamic stabbing situation. The state's own witness, trace evidence analyst Charles Lynch, testified that he recovered various fibres from the butcher knife believed to be the murder weapon. He said that he had retrieved fibres consistent with the t-shirt fibres from both Darlie and Damon's t-shirt. In addition, he found synthetic fibres under various methods of investigation that were consistent with the polyester fibres he found on the stitching of the collar of Darlie's nightshirt. He further stated that all fibres found from both t-shirts appeared to have been cut, and that both were consistent with being cut with a serrated edged knife. He discussed the defects in Darlie's nightshirt and said that at least 3 of the defects on the front right shoulder were consistent with being produced using a bloody knife blade, and that one sample was covered in blood that had saturated the front of the t-shirt he believed was consistent with being cut prior to the blood fall. However, under cross-examination, he stated that 4 defects were made with the blade of a bloody knife, and that the sample covered in blood, he could not say if it was or was not produced with the bloody knife blade due to the fact that it was covered in blood. He further described some snag-type marks to the right shoulder area. He did say under direct examination that there was a puncture defect to the left near the front collar that continues through the polyester collar stitching and into the cotton material. He further admitted that the puncture defect to the left of Darlie's shirt was consistent with her underlying injuries when the shirt was placed on a mannequin. Regardless, Lynch claimed that the defects to the right side of the nightshirt were not consistent with any underlying injuries, and that he'd concluded that Darlie had inflicted the defects in the shirt herself by holding her shirt away from her body taut with one hand. He speculated that there was what he thought was a fingerprint on her right shoulder without showing any evidence of it. He did not do any fingerprinting techniques to confirm this was a fingerprint, nor did he do any tests to see if he could create similar defects. While the defense did bring up the fact that there was no other fingerprints on the collar or the back of the shirt suggesting someone had held it up with a bloody hand and that the shirt would move, they did not go any further. Unfortunately, the defence team did not take this opportunity to challenge Lynch on his conclusions and failed to ask him if he had considered the DNA evidence in his analysis. They themselves seemingly did little to connect the DNA results to the crime scene evidence either. This would further go to show the limited time they had to prepare for such a convoluted case. In fact, much of the forensic evidence presented by the state would not only be left unexplained by the prosecution's experts, but left completely unchallenged by the defence. Darlie's defence team failed to press Lynch on how the defects in her shirt compared to those found on Damon's shirt, or even if those defects had been consistent with his underlying injuries or not. Moreover, we see from DNA testing that Lynch's conclusions are not consistent with the forensic evidence. Lynch testified that the defects were circled in red and the samples were labelled with a T and a number, cut out by serologist Catherine Long at Swifts and sent to Caroline Van Winkle for DNA testing. He specifically pointed to a sample labelled T10 as that of relating to one of the defects in the nightshirt. However, in later testimony outside of the presence of the jury, state's expert witness Tom Bevel would claim that sample TB3I was sample T10, which was further contradicted by DNA analyst Judith Floyd, who testified under oath that sample TB3I was sample 5056 in the DNA report. We see from the DNA report that sample T10 and TB3I are indeed 2 different samples. T10 revealed a mixture of both Devon and Darlie's DNA, and 5056 only matched Darlie's. Lynch said that those defects had been created using a bloody knife blade, meaning that both Darlie's and Devon's blood were present on the knife when the defect was created. Unfortunately, there was no other markings or mention of the other defects thought to have been made by a bloody knife blade. Had all these defects been tested for DNA, we may know if those defects contained Darlie's or one or a mixture of both boys' blood, meaning they were all stabbed with the same knife simultaneously. Moreover, this could go some way to explaining 4 small spots of blood that were all a mixture of both Darlie's and one of the boys on each shoulder and sleeve of Darlie's nightshirt. The state's expert witness, blood pattern analyst Tom Bevel, testified that he could only distinguish between 2 of the stains as being consistent with cast-off from a moving object. However, under cross-examination, he said that he could not be sure if the cast-off was from the knife blade, from Darlie, or from the perpetrator in close proximity to her. The boys were both within feet of Darlie and Damon was right beside her. Again, all these samples were mixtures of both Darlie's and the boys' DNA, meaning they must have all been stabbed around the same time. If these stains were indeed cast off, then it stands to reason that Darlie's blood within that stain was also cast off, which further calls into question the idea that she herself was wielding the knife. For all those samples to be mixtures and have been made at separate times in different locations at different angles defies the odds of probability. If this information is correct, it further supports the crime scene reconstruction I described in the first installment of this episode, which we will further build on as we continue. I believe that Darlie was attacked first and that the intruder sat on her and began to attack her. Devon had gotten up and gone towards his mum and was struck with the knife. He fell back, injuring the back of his leg on the corner of the glass table, and went forward again, putting his arm up to protect himself before being struck again and falling back to the ground. The intruder then continued the attack on Darlie with Devon's blood still on the knife. This would explain why some of the defects only contained Darlie's DNA, while some of the defects were a mixture of Darlie's and Devon's. This also debunks the assertion that Darlie had created the defects in her nightshirt either before she had injured herself or after she had supposedly stabbed the boys. As I said at the beginning, ask yourself, considering all of the evidence, which scenario is more probable? We see from the state's exhibit of Darlie's nightshirt that the location of the defects are consistent with a continuous slashing motion. We see that the front collar had been slashed to the left side of the nightshirt, with a further 2 defects to the left of the shirt. I believe this indicates that the collar of the nightshirt had impeded the knife, creating a skip pattern in the injuries underneath, where it eventually went through the thinner cotton material of the shirt. Darlie said that she was laying on her left side when she had fallen to sleep, and the wound to her neck starts at the right side. That nightshirt was an oversized t-shirt and would have gathered to the right side of her neck. She also has a stab wound to the left side of the chest, and just like Damon's shirt, although the defects do not exactly align, all the defects in her shirt are generally in the area where she was injured, which can be accounted for by movement and the looseness of the garment in relation to the body at the time of the event. To be continued.